Unitarian Universalist minister, Reverend Kimberly Hampton, publishes a blog article asking Unitarian Universalists, and particularly ministers, not to preach about Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. this weekend. Her call comes from a location of being present too many times when this Sunday morning means preaching a whitewashed, sanitized version of exploring King's legacy and what he has to say to us today. Her call comes from a place of too often seeing this day as a day to bring out a single legend in the midst of an entire movement and to feel charged and comforted by his ideas. Instead, she asked us last year to preach about the multi-headed hydra of materialism, racism, and militarism, King's three evils. To remember the King who challenged white moderates to act rather than staying complacent in the face of these three evils. It is my hope this morning not to fall short of her call. It is my hope this morning to break silence and to encourage you to do so as well. And oh, this day to come tomorrow, as well as this weekend, has been one of falling short for me in the past. 3 years ago, I sat on stage for a public Martin Luther King Jr. Day breakfast where faith leaders were called together to have breakfast in this huge ballroom of a local hotel, while elected officials, a few union leads, and a couple of youth were paraded on stage to speak of the legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and what it had to say to our city. Mind you, this was not Rochester. I watched as a mayor who had refused to respond to the recent police shooting of a 13-year-old black child walk onto that stage and quote King. I watched as the chair of our city council, who had just approved more military equipment for our local police force because the military was no longer using it and they needed a place to put that equipment, I guess. I watched him step onto that stage and quote King as well. The city council had just passed a budget continuing to lead us towards spiritual death, where the budget for militarizing police was much higher than the budget for education and social services. I sat between one of the city's leading philanthropists who pulled together a table of local CEOs whose wealth allowed them to determine the plan and the trajectory for that city. And on my other side, the CEO for the local YMCA, feeling as if I was in the middle of a funding conversation I did not want to be part of. And we watched as a local head manager or leader, I can't remember, of Walmart came onto the stage as a major supporter of the event, while we all sat around eating $65 banquet breakfasts, by the way, with very minimal vegan options. And I just sat there. I sat there silent, politely eating my fruit salad and oatmeal. I left that place at the end of that event feeling used, as if my very presence was supporting and condoning this practice of sanitizing this man's legacy. And I wonder if there have ever been moments for you when you have sat silently and watched. Have you ever been there? Sitting silently through a moment that you later deeply regretted. And even in the moment sat with the question, do I do something? Do I say something? Leaving and wondering what you could have said or should have said. Listening to someone you don't agree with or hearing some bigoted language and finding yourself unable to speak or frozen inside. These moments leave us, and at least they've left me, with a profound feeling of regret and possibly shame. The thought or the sense that we are inherently bad because of our actions or our inactions. It has been my experience that if we stay in that shame space, we get stuck in the silence. It's there. It's that fear that Reverend Michelle was talking about in the story this morning. Without taking the action to shift our behavior or finding space to speak up, even when it feels like a risk, and especially when it feels like a big risk, we remain silent, polite, and nothing changes. Nothing changes. Systems of oppression rely on our silence and on our compliance. They rely on us being complacent. So when I left that annual prayer breakfast, that annual Martin Luther King Jr. Day breakfast, I swore to myself and to our faith, to our justice ancestors and to our communities, that I would not be part of such a day again. And I have never turned back. That if I was going to celebrate the legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it would be in a way that challenged structural power and named the three evils of the movement he was a central part in building: materialism, racism, and militarism. And so here we are this morning to explore these together. Wealth determines so much of what happens in our country and in our city. As I was attending a comedy show, kind of a comedy show, this past Friday with Kamal Bell, his show is entitled Ending Racism in About an Hour. Very ambitious. Who else was there? Was anybody else there? Were folks there? All right, we had some folks here in the congregation who were there. As I was attending this comedy event with Kamal Bell, he showed us charts and line graphs delineating wealth inequality in this country. It was a sobering reminder that much of the money in America continually goes into white hands. He reminds us that much of this relies on property ownership, a right denied Black people and people of color well throughout this country's history. Ways that property values have continually been kept down in predominantly Black communities. Ways that Black folks have been denied access to properties of higher value through redlining practices and discrimination practices on the part of realtors as well as neighbors. These systems created the Rochester we know today, where the wealth gap is huge between Rochester suburbs and the city. I was reminded of how property ownership originated in this country with theft of lands from indigenous people who already lived here. And wealth was sustained by the enslavement of Africans, providing free and tortured labor upon which this country's wealth has been built. So much of it is theft. Just last year, celebrations of Martin Luther King Jr. Day were shared in some states and in parts of the country with celebrations of the birthday of Robert E. Lee, General Robert E. Lee. It's actually today. In some states, the celebration of legacies is shared with the celebration of the birth of a man whose life went towards the fight for continued enslavement of Africans. The same Robert E. Lee that said in a letter in 1865 that slavery was a moral and political evil, while also writing in that same letter, and I quote, "The Blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, socially, and physically. The painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race, and I hope will prepare and lead them to better things. How long their subjugation may be necessary is known and ordered by a wise, merciful providence. Their emancipation will sooner result from mild and melting influence of Christianity than the storms and tempests of fiery controversy." End quote. It is a wonder that we had such a rash of groups and communities tearing down statues of the man a few years ago. Let us not distance ourselves too far from this man, as we have a legacy in our own Unitarian and Universalist heritage of believing in enslavement's divine mandate too. There's a long lineage there. I don't want to fall into the fallacy that racism is a thing of the past, and these sentiments are to remain there for those of us living in the present day to shake our heads at and consider how far we have come. For I have heard the same sentiment espoused about our prison system in the present day. Black people are incarcerated at a rate much higher than white folks in our country. As we discuss now major concerns has been whether or not that would mean the thousands of people who are locked up for marijuana possession and distribution in our state would no longer be imprisoned. It brings up similar fears for people. Prison in our minds has become this place for rehabilitation and separation, a place where people would hopefully learn their lesson and come out changed for the better. Much of the concern I have also heard is driven by the capitalist system we create in our prisons. To incarcerate less people might devastate towns across our state where communities are supported by jobs and income from the prisons. But what we know is that mass incarceration of Black and brown people tears families apart. It leaves those who have been imprisoned with less options for housing and employment upon the end of their term. For some in some states, not here, but in some states it silences their voices to vote. When communities experience high levels of poverty, the options for one's future become limited. You can find work, though often at a low wage. You can engage in illegal work, often for a higher rate of pay and at a higher risk that may at times lead to incarceration. Or you can join the military. It is a common story for white men in this country. I hear it again and again in our communities to not have interacted with Black folks or people of color until they entered the military. That is not just happenstance. For generations and decades, this country has benefited off the labor force of Black and brown people in our military. To go back to King's 1967 speech just for a second, he was making the point that this war had been detrimental, the Vietnam War had been detrimental to support programs for the poor, that those to whom he was bringing this message of nonviolence were pointing to Vietnam as a case for necessary violence. This was the alternative narrative. And then he wrote, perhaps a more tragic recognition of reality took place when it became clear to me that the war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. It was sending their sons and their brothers and their husbands to fight and to die in extraordinarily high proportions relative to the rest of the population. We were taking the Black young men who had been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. And so we have been repeatedly faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same schools. A nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same schools. We in this room, and I heard this as part of our dream earlier, need only look so far as our Rochester city school system to see an educational community still segregated and poorly resourced, to see futures where the military seems like the best choice out of the options. This country, this city, continues to force our men and boys to fight in its endless wars, with deep moral and spiritual implications and psychological implications in their own lives. These systemic inequalities still exist. I feel like the times have not changed as much as I would like to think, and perhaps as we would like to think. I'm not saying that nothing has changed since 1967. I wasn't even born yet. I am saying that we are still dramatically racially divided. I am saying that we are still over-militarized. Our country is currently sending military out to so many places. Some we know the names of and others are kept secret from the public. I might argue that our militarism has gotten worse. Sure, people are no longer being fire-hosed in the streets for protesting and speaking up. Instead, they are tear-gassed and attacked with riot gear, recycled gear from the military given to our police. And the wealth gap grows and grows and grows, with more of this nation's wealth going into the hands of the few. So what are we to do about all this? It can feel so overwhelming. What are we to do? Where do we start with making those dreams possible that we held here dedication this morning. Some of the spiritual death, I believe Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was speaking to, the spiritual death in our country, the one that he mentioned was funding the military over and above social services. I think some of the spiritual death that comes about as a result of that is believing that those kids and young people who are being imprisoned at a higher rate, who are sitting in segregated and under-supported schools, who are being directed towards the military, believing that those kids are not our kids. Those kids are our kids. It is a rift, a rending of the garment that ties us all together. Without the belief that these children are our children, that what affects them shapes the future for us all, we are able to sit by passively, shaking our heads at what is happening to them, but still maintaining our own comfort. To come back to spiritual life is to wake up, to recognize that we have actual agency and power, especially as we are part of larger movements. To look around at where we are, our workplaces, our communities, our downtown location, places we are already involved in, to see what our realm of influence could be to make policy changes. To wake up is about speaking up in those moments when we would rather remain silent with friends and loved ones who are sharing views that harm the poor, that harm people of races possibly different from our own. And that is just on the interpersonal level. Right now, a movement is being built in our state to end solitary confinement. The implications of this are huge. Right now, people are continuing to organize around the Rochester City School District, knowing that the recent budget cuts are not the end of the conversation. Right now, our local city council is in need of our support as they are coming under fire for putting someone who has been convicted of a felony on the Police Accountability Board, bringing the perspective of someone who has seen the system from the inside, a necessary perspective. And right now, there are movements for peace. Folks who have been showing up to challenge the military-industrial complex. This past week, I shared in my weekly church-wide email, which I know all of you read, that there will be quizzing, that the local Poor People's Campaign, which is continuing King's legacy of focusing on these three evils, has a big event coming up February 7th. Friends, get involved. I know many of you already are. But get involved. And get involved as if these systemic injustices affected you and your children, because they do. What's happening now is going to shape the future. It shapes our reality right now. The deeper spiritual work to do here, to get to a place of action, is to get curious about why we stay silent, or why we resist taking action. Take these moments into your meditative practice, into your spiritual practice. If you are the praying type, pray over them. If you're the walking type, walk and keep them in your hearts. The time is now to wake up. The time is now to face with honesty and integrity the world that surrounds us. Our very lives and our very futures are at stake, and we cannot remain silent any longer. Amen. Blessed be, and may it be so.